Hello! In this video, we're going to take a look at navigating the Unity interface. I remember the first time that I opened up Unity, and I was quite overwhelmed with all of the panels and windows that there were to interact with. I hope that this video helps put your mind at ease, as we're going to cover each of them in great detail. I've gone ahead and set up a blank project. If you need a review, please take a look at the project setup video on how to create a new 2D project inside of Unity. We're going to get started going from left to right talking about the different windows. On the very left-hand side of your screen is our first window, the hierarchy. Now, the hierarchy, as you can see here, is a redockable panel, just like the other panels. What I mean by that is you can take your mouse, hold down the left mouse button, and go ahead and drag this to a different area on your screen. You could even make it a free floating window, which is very helpful if you have multiple monitors, as when you're developing a very large project, you can sort of put different windows in different areas, and that's very helpful. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to go ahead and redock this on the left-hand side of my screen. Now, we have a scene here. Now it's called Untitled because we do not currently have it saved. Let's go ahead and save a new scene just for practice. We'll go up to the File menu, select Save As, and we'll call this My First Scene. Perfect. Now the My First Scene that we just created is a .unity file. You'll notice that it got created down here in the project window. If you have another folder there, sometimes Unity will include a scenes folder. You may have a sample scene inside there. It's very good to talk about file organization. When we get to the project window, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So just hold tight for a second. Going back to the hierarchy discussion, we see the name of our scene, and we also have a little drop-down arrow. Now, this is showing all of the game objects that are in our scene. So, formally, the hierarchy shows you a list of all the game objects that are currently in your scene. So, it's hard to talk about the hierarchy without talking about the scene, so let's go ahead and bring that in. So the scene view is really where all the magic happens. This is where you're going to be bringing all of your assets. By assets, we mean things like sound clips, images, animation, video, all of the different things that you'll be learning throughout this series of videos into one culmination that's going to create your final project. In the scene view, we're going to go ahead and drag some items in here, and for the purposes of this video, let's actually go ahead and create an object. The File menu up here at the top has a lot of information in it and is outside the scope of this video to cover everything inside of it. We'll have more specific videos on topics such as animation, game object development, and such, that we'll leave the discussion of those file menus to those videos. For this video, we're going to go ahead and just create a cube. So let's go ahead and select Game Object, 3D Object, and select Cube. Now, even though it is a 3D object and we're viewing this in a 2D space, it's still going to be visible. We'll be able to see it, and it's going to look like a plane to us. Now, if you haven't watched the Unity Navigation Transform tutorial video, we're going to cover the move tools inside of there, but for the time being, we're going to go ahead and select the second one from the left, and that is going to be the move tool. The move tool is going to show you this Cartesian axis, which represents the X direction and the Y direction. You can click down with your left mouse button to drag the object around, and we'll talk about what this is actually doing a little bit further on. What I wanted to show you, though, was in relation to the hierarchy. We created a game object. This game object is a cube. The cube resides inside of the scene. If you're having a little bit of trouble understanding what a scene is, a really good example of it is think of going to your local theater and watching a play. The plays have multiple scenes. In Unity, you're going to be creating projects with multiple scenes, and you as the end user or the person that is actively engaging in the content or consuming the content, you are seeing everything that's going on in the scenes. But your position now is a developer. You are the game developer, you are the code developer, you're your own project manager. These are all the things that you're going to be doing, and it's your job to build your scene with what you have envisioned in your mind, following your creative aptitude, and that's really where the magic of Unity happens. So continuing on here, the relationship that I wanted to show was between the hierarchy and the scene. We have the cube selected. You can see in the hierarchy, the list of the game objects, we now have a cube. A really useful command is Control D. Control D on your keyboard with the object selected is going to duplicate it. Doesn't look like much has happened after I pressed Control D, but you'll notice as we have a cube parentheses 1 in our hierarchy, which means we now have two separate cubes. So let's go ahead and drag this, and now we can more appropriately see those two. Now, we're going to talk about prefab instances and the difference between game object instances in another video. But for the purposes of this video, we have two distinct objects that have their own properties. The best way to know that they're distinct as well, they don't have any relationship between them inside the hierarchy. For example, we can move this cube independent of this cube. I'm selecting on them in this scene view by left-clicking with the mouse. However, if I were to take this cube, hold down the left mouse button, and drag it on top of this one, you'll notice that the relationship in the hierarchy changes. This is actually forming a parent-child relationship, where this cube is now the parent of this cube, meaning when we move this cube, you'll notice that the other cube is actually going to move, because this object or child now belongs to this parent, but the child can move independently. So for example, if I wanted to reposition this so that the cubes kind of look like that, where one was overlapping the other, I can then do that and then move them together. So that's a really crucial thing to understand, especially when you're working in Unity early on, is the parent-child relationship between objects. Alright, so enough about the hierarchy, and we talked about the scene view. Let's talk about the game view now. So the game view, what I'm going to do is have you hold down the left mouse button, drag your game view tab, and try to dock it side by side with the scene view, and then reposition our windows so that we can see them next to each other. Perfect. So now you see if we have these objects selected in the scene view, we can move them appropriately with the mouse, and we also notice them moving on the right hand side in our game view. The game view is what the end user, or the person consuming your project, is going to see. It's really helpful, and I strongly recommend, as you're developing in not just Unity, but if you're doing web development or anything of that nature, to get a second monitor. The benefits, even if you have to purchase it, far outweigh that, because you don't have to constantly switch back and forth between those two things. So I would strongly recommend getting that. It'll save you so much time. You can focus on two things at once, and especially with Unity, I can speak from my own experience. It's very helpful to be able to see the scene view and the game view at the same time. So here, when I make changes, I can see it update in my game view respectively. Now this is a really ugly blue background. Let's go ahead and change that. So one thing we haven't talked about that's in the hierarchy right now is that main camera. If we select on it, just like that, you'll notice that the Cartesian coordinate system here is going to reposition itself to the center of the scene, because this box here represents our camera. You can actually see this blue already right there in the background properties. So I think now would be a good time to talk about the inspector. So you may have noticed when we were selecting on different game objects, we were actually changing the properties. We were viewing the properties of the objects. So for example, if I select the main camera, and then if I select the cube, and then the cube 1, you'll notice that these values, and also the name of the object, those are all changing. The hierarchy, again, shows a list of the game objects in the scene. The inspector shows you the properties of the currently selected object. So, if I have the main camera selected as I do now, I can see all of the properties of that object in the inspector. If I go ahead and select the background, I can pick something a little easier on the eyes, such as this nice white background, and that contrasts these squares here very nicely. Alright, so let's talk about the inspector a little bit more in depth. Again, that inspector is going to show you the properties of the currently selected object. Everything on the inspector is called a component. You can see there's a button here at the bottom called Add Component. In the future, you're going to be adding components to game objects. Things like the ability to collide with objects, the ability to have physics, the ability to have animation. Those are all different components that are related to a game object. Now, one thing that I may have been throwing around a little bit that I hope maybe you thought of was the relationship between an asset and a game object. So they are very similar, and developers tend to throw them around together. They do have a distinct difference though. Our assets, these are things you can actually see. We'll talk about the project window here a little bit. We have the name assets here, and this scene is actually an asset. It's a .unity file. When we did the file save as, you can have multiple scenes. They're all different assets. The cubes are assets. Any images, any sound, any video, animation, you're going to bring those down here in the project window, and those are going to be the assets of the project. When we bring them up to the hierarchy, we say that they are game objects in the scene. And that's why we also have this name, game object here, is because all of these different things, lighting, audio, video, UI, they're all different types of game objects. They're assets down here. When we bring them into the scene, they become those game objects. Very minute difference. Don't worry too much about it. I just wanted to talk about the relationship about it. Alright, but we were talking about the inspector and the components on the inspector. And there are a lot of components. If you take a look at the add component, you can click through these lists. There are a bunch of things that we're going to be talking about in specific videos. Don't worry about any of this stuff right now. All that I would like you to take away from this video is the inspector shows the properties of the currently selected object. An object has components, and components are all these different things that we can minimize, just like that. Now, it's hard to tell the difference here, but this mesh renderer is one component. These drop-downs here, these are properties of that component. But when you minimize this just like that, we can say that this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different components on it. It has the transform component, which represents its position, rotation, and scale in the Unity world. It has the mesh filter, which stores 3D information. It has the mesh renderer, which is responsible for actually showing it on the Unity screen. It has a box collider, we're in reference to the cube right now, which allows it to have collision with other objects in the scene. This is especially helpful if you're developing, for example, a video game. It also has a default material on it, which gives it some color. The material could be a texture, or just a solid color, or anything of that nature. Textures, materials, shaders, those are going to be a separate video. Please check that out. Alright. I think that's enough for the inspector. Last thing I would like to note about it, though, is the ability to turn on and off objects. So we have the name of the object here, and right next to it we have this checkbox. This checkbox, if you select it and click it, that's going to deactivate it. And if you re-click it, that's going to activate the object. So we say an active object, inactive object. Inactive objects are not going to be interacted. They're not going to show up. It's kind of like they don't even exist. But you can see that the Cartesian system is still there, so it's showing where it is inside of the Unity scene itself, but it's in no way going to affect the final product of it. It's really nice for debugging or just figuring out why something's not working, or if you just really need to hide something, you can go ahead and just turn it off. An important thing to note, though, is for your more advanced users, if you do turn something off in the inspector by unchecking that checkbox, none of your scripts on that object are going to run. If you have no idea what a script is, please don't worry about that. We're going to have many videos covering the concepts of scripting inside of Unity. Alright, the last two windows that I'd like to talk about briefly are the project and the console windows. So the project window you can think of synonymous to a file structure system. You can even view it in Windows Explorer by right-clicking anywhere in this area and selecting Show in Explorer, and you're going to see it's going to bring you to the top level folder. Now this assets is equivalent to this assets folder here. If we go ahead and double click into it, you'll see that we have this My First Scene, and this is a Unity scene file. That was the .unity extension when we created the scene. We also have a .meta. Don't interact with the .metas at all. Those contain high-level information about these objects here, or these files here. So these are going to be automatically created for you. I don't think about meta objects at all for example, when I'm doing my day-to-day Unity activities. And especially for lower courses like 282 and 382, you won't be working with meta files in those courses. So, for example, if we were to create a folder inside of here, and I strongly recommend that when you create a new Unity project, get into the habit of organizing your file system right off the bat. So, for example, we're going to create several different folders, and I would encourage you to do this. We're going to right-click, create a folder. The first one that we're going to create is, let's create a scripts folder. That's the one that I use the most, so I'll go ahead and create that first. It's going to automatically alphabetize these for us. Another popular one is materials. You're going to have textures inside of your project. Textures are synonymous with your images, so we'll go ahead and create textures. And I always like to have a prefabs folder. You don't know what prefabs are, but a prefab, just a 30-second explanation is, think of a video game, and let's say you have like a laser gun that shoots out lasers. Well, we don't create, for example, if the person is shooting 60,000 lasers, we don't have 60,000 different laser templates. We have one single laser template that every time the player presses down, like for example the left mouse button to shoot the laser, it's going to create a copy of that prefab. Maybe an easier way to think about it is, we're going to represent it in CPS 282 as an image. So when the user left clicks their mouse, they're going to create a new laser, and every time they click, they're going to create a new laser image, and it's going to just shoot over and over, creating those new images. We have a separate video talking about prefabs. I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that, but we'll definitely be covering that later in the course. Alright, so these are just a few of the folders that you'll be creating: materials, prefabs, scripts, textures, and I like to also have one for audio, or sounds in general, you could call it. Perfect. Alright, and then the last window here is the console. So we're going to have a video, if you'd like to take it up, Unity's most common errors. The console, for the time being, is going to show you what is wrong with your project. In some cases, you're going to run into issues where you're going to have giant blocks of red text. You're going to click the play button. Now the play button is used to run the application, and it's just going to stay, for in this case it's blue because we don't have any errors with it. If we did have an error, it would say please resolve all errors before entering into play mode in a text box right here. And then you would click to the console, and the console is going to show you a red block of text, and that red block of text is usually going to be an error message, an exception. Common ones are like null references and missing argument exceptions. It can also be used for debugging purposes. For example, if you had a coin counter game or a collector game and you wanted to count the number of coins that the player was collecting, you could debug those and print those out to the console. The console tab is going to be a little bit more relevant once we get to the scripting portion of this course, so please keep that in the back of your mind about what it does. If you ever run into any problems with your Unity, check the console first, see if there's any red text, and try to see what it means. But you'll, especially when you're first learning Unity, you'll have to reach out to your instructor, or please leave a comment on this video, or check out the common issues inside of Unity video to resolve that issue. Alright, so I think I've gone on for a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I hope this video was a brief overview of the Unity interface. We didn't get very specific on things because we can dive into one thing and I can talk about it for a half an hour. But I just wanted to talk to you briefly about what each of the windows that you're looking at are. One that you noticed that we didn't hit was the Asset Store. That's going to have its own separate video. Take a look for the Unity Asset Store video. The Asset Store, though, if you're curious, is a way for you to download and purchase game objects, music, images, anything you can think of from Unity or from any content creators. So that's really exciting. But we covered the hierarchy, which shows you a list of all the game objects in your scene. We talked about the difference between the scene and the game view. and how the scene is going to be your active workspace and the game view is going to be an image of the final product. Um, that when you press play, the user is actually going to be able to see and interact with. We talked about the inspector, where after you select on an object, either in the scene or in the hierarchy, the inspector shows you the properties of that object. And then we talked about the project window, which is your file structure system, and then finally what the console is. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to put them in the comment section below, or please reach out to your instructor with any further questions. Thank you very much.